All right, it's March 29th, Sunday, about 5 o'clock. Starting off the 2026 Apple pathology season. Always begin with Scab. We're just going to go over the basics in this very first short video. And let's talk about best practices, and we'll have the forecast and everything else coming up later. Okay, what do we know about apple scab? It's a big problem in the eastern and northeastern Great Lakes area of the United States, particularly where we have cold, wet weather. Kind of cold, wet, temperate production regions. Temperatures around March will be in the 50s and moving into April in the 50s and 60s, making it perfect for that apple scab that really likes that 55, 50. Start to get 48, gets a little too cold with it. A lot of the things we like to plant, with the exception of something like Honeycrisp, is susceptible to apple scab. This is what it looks like. You'll get these later on thick, scabby looking lesions on the leaves. It'll be sporulating like crazy, and the early infections on the fruit will look like this. They'll be also olive covered, sort of fuzzy, and that's just tons of spores. As the fruit develops, they'll kind of separate out and crack and maybe dry up a little bit, but their spores will already have been ejected and splashed around the orchard. Any one of the lesions will cause the fruit to be removed from the fresh market environment. And I would imagine an apple as bad as this one probably wouldn't even be taken very lightly for even the processing. What does it take to beat it? Conventional, about 10 fungicide applications a year. You're going for the organic or resistance. I think you're going to be really, if you have organic, you can either use resistance to apple scab, great, very few, or you're looking at about 14 plus biopesticides applications per year. Even if you have resistance to apple scab, you won't have resistance to all the other diseases. You might be faced with about 14 biopesticide applications a year. Where does the thing live? Right now, this is where it lives. Down on the orchard floor in this strange research orchard, very widely spaced, fairly old large trees, 25 years old or so or more. And it lives down in all the leaf litter. And right around now is when the enough heating and overwintering um, chill hours have put these as these pseudothecia, which live inside the lesions. Inside the lesion, this is a leaf lesion here from the side, sliced in half. This is what the fungus looks like from underneath that scab. It's kind of a little locule, and inside the locule are these little sacs, and in them are the infamous ascospores. These will be maturing right now as we get good weather and water over the course of the winter. Weather being optimal about the 55s. We've already mentioned that a little bit already. That's really things like to mature and develop. Once they mature, they will eject into the sky. And around this time, your apples will have sort of green tissue, little bits of leaves, and as you move into bloom and petal fall, small fruit. And then these will cause infections of that sort of stuff right there. Later on, if you do get infections early on the young developing fruit or sort of cluster leaves, you can kind of see down here, they'll be kind of pale and diffuse. These will still be making spores, and then they will continually make a different type of spore that will form on the newly infected fruit and spread around the entire tree and planting. They don't go very far, a couple hundred meters at most, but for the most part, what's in the tree stays in the tree. What's in the orchard stays in the orchard. And these will cause infections as you get cool, wet weather on sort of newly forming shoots, sort of the terminal shoots, and on the developing fruit again, putting your fruit at risk the entire time. Doesn't go very far, a couple hundred meters at most, but as I said before, what's in the tree stays on the tree. So everything you do on your farm influences how easy and challenging this disease will be to manage. They don't really spread as much from neighboring farms or around regions. All of your management will be location and site specific. So if it's entrenched in one field, the next field next over might be really easy depending on what you did to manage it with it. Always best to start off with best horticultural practices. I always like to use resistant cultivars for dealing with apple scab. Some of the best ones here: Enterprise, Freedom, Gold Rush, Jonah Free, Liberty. So many different ones: Williams Pride, Crimson Crisp, even Honeycrisp. Different type of gene situation for Honeycrisp, but it's also very resistant and if not immune to apple scab. A lot of these will have immunity through a single gene product in them, RVI6, with the exception of Honeycrisp. But this doesn't really give you resistance to the other diseases. Like Topaz is a fine one for dealing with apple scab, but this variety seems to melt really easily to Phytophthora root rot, which is an aquatic organism, the same one that caused the Irish potato famine, a little different species, but same aggressiveness, and will just sort of melt these types of apples pretty easy. So even if you have resistance to scab, doesn't mean you're going to escape all the other problems. But to always, for any of them, and apple scab and other diseases, the best places to start off is with sanitation. Get rid of and destroy fruit drops, leaf litter, prunings. Now, the prunings aren't so much for apple scab, but they house a lot of other diseases that we'll talk about throughout the season. And fruit drops as well, old thinning mummies, anything you can get rid of. If there's dead plant material on the ground, get rid of it. It avoids the accumulation of inoculum for the most part. So one of the best places to do this is to do fall or spring leaf shredding. Rake everything into the middles and then scalp the sod. Or you can put down a urea application, 40 pounds per 100, or dolomitic lime at 2.5 pounds per acre. Now, what's shown in this picture is a machine in Brazil that had a bunch of paddles, and it would sweep all the junk from underneath the row, as you can see down there, into the row middles, and then they would come and grind it and chop it up. Sweep that side next, grind and chop it up, and it goes on for quite some time. This is just to get rid of that initial inoculum. In addition to that, you'll want to use a delayed dormant application of copper at silvertip, and if not, moving into half-inch green as well. This will get inside the buds and all the cracks, and even will take out fire blight cankers, we'll talk about a little bit later, and get any overwintering scab canidia or any other spores that are left over from the previous season inside the tissues. This will sort of wipe it all off and help start your whole epidemic off clean. So what does this look like typically? What you might see as sort of a diagrammatic approach to how effective this type of stuff can be. If you manage all of the inoculum at the beginning, all those ascospores at the beginning of the whole season, it's going to make the entire season that much easier to deal with. Or you can begin to use more things like biopesticides and have a successful management program. And as we mentioned before, starting here in the orchard floor, fall or spring urea, how do you know which one to do? Typically, you would do the one that you can drive in the orchards. It's been a very wet spring right now in 2026. I hope everyone did this type of practice in the fall, 2025, when everything was dry as a bone and we had drought-like conditions through a lot of New York. Even if you're already moving into the season, it's still a value to try to knock some of this out, but be very careful. You don't want to get stuck in the orchard. So that's how you determine when to do it. If you can never drive in the orchard in the spring, always do this at the end of the season in the fall. And we'll hash back up on that again towards the end of our videos for the 2026 season. So after that, we're coming into a copper or silver tip. This will start to get some things. Also at this time, even though models may predict ascospores being mature, this is a pseudothecium. This is a side shot of the leaf. That other one was a lot of colored with a lot of special microscope stains, stuff like that. But this is sort of colorless and gray. And then you'll see these sort of, these are ascospores right there in an ascus. They're hard to visualize inside the side shot of the pseudothecium. But anyway, around this time, as they mature and as rain falls and the temperature's right, they're going to eject into the air, land on your green tip tissues, just breaking bud, and start a primary infection. And after this point, they will cause infections, make new lesions that make a different type of spore that rips up from the epidermis. These are these young, early, fuzzy-looking scabs. And then they'll start causing additional infections of fruit, which will then sporulating again. And then this cycle will just continue going over and over and over and over and over until the inoculum gets very high. After a while, the lesions on the terminal leaves on your young shoots will be too numerous. Leaves might fall off early if they get too much of that and lead to problems with overwintering and return bud set and bloom. So what this might look like in a theoretical sense, if you were to do nothing, you have your apple scab incidence, which is the number of lesions on a fruit or a leaf, ranging from 0% of all the leaves to 100% of all the leaves of fruit. And sort of a theoretical basis, if you did nothing, this would happen and rise up pretty quickly until around this point here when you get those secondary cycles and it shoots up very fast and rockets straight towards harvest. Now, the idea being is if you start to remove some sanitation with urea, it's almost as if you take this entire progression and shift it closer to harvest. You want to get to harvest with no inoculum whatsoever. And that was kind of the early plan for some of the first season sprays when you're actually going after ascospores and all this stuff. You want to sort of push that all the way to harvest. And then you might come back later and do a silver tip copper, and that might push it a different route. These are all hypotheticals. But if you do the two, the idea being is you're taking this inoculum and beating it down, pushing it so much that by the time you get to harvest, you're really only dealing with about 33%. Now, ideally, if you do a pretty good job of putting things on from green tip here all the way to about petal fall or bloom, this whole curve will just sort of be pushed over to nothing. Now, if we look at it for the other part, using those protectant fungicides, copper and sulfur for organic, or Captan and Mancozeb from green tip to bloom, that's really going to push your curve. But later in the season, when you start to run into secondary infections, it won't take much for these things to ramp up and make a very high progression from 0 apple scab to 100% fairly quickly. You'll want to put on any antisporulin fungicides. Typically, these are going to be your single-site fungicides that have antisporulin activity, particularly the QOIs. We'll talk a little bit about them a little bit later in the season, or even something as sort of general biocidal, like an organic option might be oxidate that will damage and break up the spores here, and then they won't be able to do these. But if you do these protectant fungicides, as you're starting to get lesions, these will also take your curve and flatten it. Ideally, here you've pushed it very close to harvest. But if you hadn't, you can begin to use single site fungicides from bloom to second cover, and it will take the sort of slope of this line that's rising very rapidly to high levels of apple scab and begin to flatten it. And if you do a whole full season program with antisporulants, if these things are taking off and constantly reinfecting your fruit, you'll take this line and flatten it all the way to the bottom. The idea being, when you do this part and you do the early season part with the protectant fungicides from green tip to bloom, you just walk with a flat line to harvest and you're safe. And then with that, that's where we really like to push sort of early on. The copper, the sulfur, they are organic options. The Cap 10 and the Mancozeb will really get us all the way from green tip to bloom and sort of beat down that early inoculum so that these infections don't occur and lead to the secondary infections that ruin your fruit as well. Now, also in this early period, you might even put in something like dodine. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But as you move into the secondary apple scab period, this is where we save the fancy things. Be about every 5 to 7 days from bloom to third cover. If you're organic, you might need to decrease this interval to 4 to 5. And this is where we'll use a lot of the single site materials that are in the groups of DMIs, QOIs, and SDHIs. And we'll talk about those groups a little bit later. These will have some of the antisporulin activity. They're great protectants, and they give you a little bit of antisporulin as well. If you're not, if you can't use these because you're organic, you're kind of left with the bacillus-based antimicrobials. They'll also kill spores and stuff as well. Now, the best part to succeed, and this is why I do all the forecasting, is apple scab disease forecasting is essential to pick the best time to apply. And this can be found at nua.cornell.edu. You can just Google this, and then you can make your way to the apple scab page pretty quickly. And what this will do is it'll predict ascospore maturity, ejection, and infection events. So whether or not they're maturing, are they flying through the air, and even if they are flying through the air, is it sufficient water and temperature to cause an infection? Those are the things we're going to be getting. It'll tell you graphs of the maturity, and will even tell you daily weather summaries, and it gives you that infection event summary. It'll give you the sort of warnings in advance of the possible types of infection, and it uses local and satellite weather data and leaf wetness algorithms as well if farms do not have leaf wetness sensors. It really just goes after the apple scab maturity and ascospore infection dynamics. It'll use forecast data fairly conservatively. It will give a little bit less weight to the water predictions 3 to 5 days out than the 1 to 2 days. It will really take these with caution. As you know, it's very challenging to predict water more than a couple of days out from the event, whether it's snow, whether it's rain. It always seems like the weather forecasting systems are getting it wrong, but for the most part, it's just too challenging to do. They're going to predict all sorts of favorable conditions for infection. So there are going to be a lot of infections, but you really don't need to apply at all of them. Apply at the highest risk periods, and that's why I'll give my advice on how to identify those. The basic way to how to identify them is if you are looking at an infection period and it's predicting 15 to 20% ascospore ejection or about 2 inches of weekly rain, that's something to go after. If it's one of the lighter periods and hasn't been one in a while, maybe you'd put something on. Something less than 10%, less than 5%, you might be able to walk away from unless it's the first event of the season. Try always spraying after infection period. Don't let a bunch of infection periods pop up and then spray. It's a great way to select for resistance, and we don't want that. So this is sort of my overview of the whole season program, and I'll walk us through up through the first couple of weeks through green tip, moving into tight cluster. And you always want to start out with a sanitation, urea, or sweeping. That's sort of what the white arrow is. Then move into 1 to 2 coppers if you're conventional. And if you're trying to avoid using Cap 10 and Mancozeb out of fear for the future, this is what you might do. You would come into this period and you might rely on a different group of fungicides, the group 9s and Analytopyrimidines. What they're very good at is controlling apple scab. This will be your Scala and your Vanguard. Good at scab, good at stuff like botrytis. We don't have botrytis in apple orchards, but they don't have a lot of activity later on, and they're good in cold weather. So your group 9s here, Scala Vanguard materials are quite excellent as there. If you have big rainy weeks, then you might want to put in the Dodine. Also, another one is good activity against apple scab, not good activity against the others. And then if it's a light week and there's not a lot of rain going on, not a lot of apple scab ejection, you could swing and try a biopesticide. Otherwise, you would just do your Cap 10 Manzate Max combo. And I try to avoid moving in the single sites. These are these ones, group 7, 11, 3, and 52s until almost bloom. And then once you get through those, you'll begin to move into the covers. I still like to keep the single sites around. You have up to 4 groups you can rotate fairly effectively, 7, 11, 352, and you'll put these in. Why do we save them for the end of the season? Because they're good on rusts, mildews, apple blotches, fruit rots, fly speck, sooty blotch, and everything else. If we use up all our use allowances for scab only in the beginning, where we have a lot more options, you're in trouble. Now, if you're an organic, things get really scary. I definitely recommend trying to go with 3 coppers up front after the sanitation urea, and everything else you've got are some various biopesticides. So, sort of to summarize everything and a step-by-step approach to get you through the first part of green tip. All right, in the fall or spring, whenever you get in the orchard, use that urea, put that down. That's going to make most of your job taken care of. I don't do this in my research plots because it would ruin every apple scab research trial that I have. It is so effective that I can't get a successful research trial because there's no apple scab. The second one, if it's at silver tip or you're going into silver tip or you're even in green, the delayed dormant copper. I like those 15% MCEs. There's not a lot of tissue to get injured, and it's a good opportunity for you to use a high metallic copper equivalent copper at this point. Now, green tip, half-inch green. I'm really going to go through, and this doesn't matter if you're organic or you're conventional. I really like the coppers. I will do up to 3 of these. It should be pretty safe. We have sprayed horticultural plots with these 3 coppers up into the half-inch green. Early half-inch green, once you start getting in the tight cluster, you might want to move away from copper. And what I like to do, I still, even for these big events, the copper is so good, so thick, and so nice and covering. I'll even go for a greater than 15% ascospore ejection or 5 days of rain. Just put another copper in after the rain. With that, we're going to stop here and we'll talk about tight cluster and bloom next week or the week after. All right, have a good one.